It started with a pig. Not a battle, not a speech, not a declaration of war, just a wandering pig, a vegetable garden, and a single gunshot. And for a brief, very real moment in history, that pig nearly dragged two global powers into war.
Welcome to Uncommon History, the podcast that uncovers the overlooked, untold, and often surprising stories that shaped our world. Each episode, we dig beneath the surface of familiar events to reveal the strange, the inspiring, and the forgotten threads of history.
Welcome to the Uncommon History Podcast, where we cover the stories they didn't teach you, but they should have. Before we jump in, make sure you're following the show on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast platform you listen. Make sure you give us a follow, leave us a comment, and don't forget, every episode has a free companion article over on our Substack page. You'll find the link in our show notes. All right, let's talk about the war that almost started over a pig. Part 1, a quiet island with a hidden problem. Off the far northwestern corner of the United States, scattered between Washington Territory and Vancouver Island, sits a chain of small, quiet islands. One of them is called San Juan Island. At first glance, it doesn't look like a place would even matter much in history. It's green, peaceful, about 15 miles long and 7 miles wide. Rolling hills in the north, rich pasture in the south, and surrounded by water full of cod, halibut, and salmon. In 1859, it was the home of only a handful of settlers. Among them was an American farmer named Lyman Cutler, often referred to in earlier accounts as Hubs, who raised sheep on the southern end of the island. To the north lived a man named Charles Griffin, an employee of the British Hudson Bay Company. Griffin raised pigs, and those pigs, they had a habit. They wandered. Part 2, the shot heard across the strait. Day after day, those pigs roamed freely across San Juan Island, ignoring boundaries, fences, and property lines. And most importantly, they kept wandering into Cutler's land, in his field, into his crops, into his vegetable garden. Now, anyone who's ever tried to grow anything knows you don't mess with a man's garden. At first, it was an annoyance, then a frustration, then a problem. Finally, Cutler had enough. He warned Griffin, "Keep your pigs off my land, or I'll shoot the next one that comes through." Griffin heard him. The pigs, well, they didn't. Because the very next day, one of them crossed the line. It wandered straight into Cutler's garden and began doing what pigs do best, rooting, tearing, and destroying everything in sight. Cutler saw it, walked back to his house, grabbed his rifle, came back, and shot the pig. One shot, one dead pig. And just like that, history took a turn. Part 3, from farm dispute to international incident. When Griffin found his pig lying dead, he was furious. That wasn't just livestock. This was property. And more importantly, this was British property. So Griffin did something bold. He got in his boat. He crossed the water to Victoria, the British administrative center on Vancouver Island, and reported the incident. British authorities issued a warrant for Cutler's arrest. Soon after, a British constable sailed back to San Juan Island, walked up to Cutler's home, and read the warrant. Cutler's response? Simple, direct, and defiant. "I'm an American citizen. I don't want to answer to British authority." Constable left, but not quietly. He promised to return with force. Now things were escalating. Part 4, the military arrives. Cutler knew this wasn't over, so he did what any smart man would do in this tense situation. He called for backup. He sent word to Port Townsend in Washington's territory, asking the United States military for protection. The message reached General William S. Harney, and Harney didn't hesitate. He ordered troops to San Juan Island. American soldiers landed on the island, set up camp, and raised the American flag. From across the water in Victoria, British officials watched this unfold. And they were not pleased. What had been a quiet island dispute was now a military standoff. Part 5, 2 flags, 1 island. The British responded quickly. Warships moved into position. Cannons were ready. Tensions rose. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like war might actually break out. But cooler heads stepped in. British Governor Sir James Douglas urged caution. Instead of opening fire, he suggested a show of presence. So the British troops were sent to the island. They set up camp on the northern end. And just like that, San Juan Island had two armies. American troops in the south, British troops in the north. Two flags, two nations, one island. All because of a pig. Part 6, the strangest standoff in history. Now here's where the story takes a turn that only Uncommon History could deliver. Despite the attention, despite the warships, and despite the loaded cannons, the soldiers, they didn't fight. In fact, they become friends. They fished together, held dinners together, played sports together, while politicians argued, while newspapers stared fear, while civilians shouted about war. The men with guns, well, they chose peace. It was one of the most bizarre military standoffs in history. Part 7, the real issue and why it mattered. Because the truth is, this was never really about a pig. It was about boundaries. For decades, the United States and Britain had argued over where exactly the border should run in the Pacific Northwest. A treaty in 1846 had settled most of it along the 49th parallel. But near the coast, things got messy. There were multiple waterways, multiple channels, and one key question, which channel defined the boundary? San Juan Island sat right between them. Whoever controlled the island controlled the access to the region. It wasn't just land, it was strategy, power, control, and suddenly, thanks to one pig, that question would no longer be ignored. Part 8, peace through patience. Instead of rushing into war, both nations stepped back. Negotiations began. Troop levels were reduced, and San Juan Island entered into a rare situation, joint military occupation. For years, American and British forces shared the island peacefully. Meanwhile, diplomats worked. Arguments were written, cases were built, evidence was presented. Finally, both nations agreed to arbitration. They handed the decision to a neutral third party, the Emperor of Germany. Part 9, the final decision. In 1872, after years of debate, study, and analysis, a decision came. The Emperor ruled in favor of the United States. The boundary would run through the Canal de Haro. San Juan Island would belong to America. The British accepted that decision, lowered their flag, and then left the island. No war, no battle, no bloodshed, except for one unfortunate pig. Part 10, why this story matters. This is one of those stories that feels almost too strange to be true. A pig, a garden, a gunshot, and yet it nearly triggered a war between two powerful nations. But it also shows something else, that even when tensions rise, even when pride is at stake, even when military power is present, war is not predestined. Leadership matters, restraint matters, wisdom matters, and sometimes the difference between war and peace comes down to whether someone's willing to pause instead of pull the trigger. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Uncommon History. If you enjoyed this story, the strange, the overlooked, the almost forgotten, make sure to follow the show and leave a review. It helps more people discover the history they were never taught. You'll find all of our links down in the show notes. And until next time, this is Uncommon History, where the smallest moments can shape the biggest stories.